Hello, everybody. We will get started. Thank you for being here. I want to mention a couple of things before I get started with the introduction of our guest speaker. First of all, we expect after the initial comments by the speaker to have, we hope, some time for Q&A. So be thinking about tough questions for Mike Hengel. Secondly, after this activity, and somebody help me if there's a student representative from the ONA club in the room, there is a reception or conversation planned with Mike after this speech, and that starts at what time? 5:30. 5:30, and what place? In the Lynn reading room. And others are invited?
Yes, everybody is invited.
Everybody is invited. I am Caesar Andrews, and this is another in a series of forums by the Reynolds School of Journalism and the Center for Advanced Media Studies. We invite media leaders and thinkers and others with a story to tell, to talk about trends in the industry, to talk about how they feel and what they think about some of the dynamic things that are going on in the industry. And of course, there are many. I think it's safe to say that our speaker today has a story to tell that is interesting and relevant. Up through December, our speaker, Michael Hengel, was the editor of the Las Vegas Review-Journal. Someone, as 2015 was winding down, decided to purchase that newspaper. That someone decided not to reveal his name. And this secrecy set up a few days of turmoil and confusion and debate. And not just over the issue of ethical matters that crop up when the newsroom is trying to figure out how do you cover your own company and your own boss, and in essence yourself, but also the public relations confrontations and the fallout that resulted from this incident. The speculation about the ownership centered eventually on one Las Vegas billionaire. Anybody in the room know that name? Yes, sir. That's exactly who it is, Sheldon Adelson. And in this case, even though we warn students about speculation and rumors, but in this case, as it turns out, the speculation was correct. And indeed, the new owner is Sheldon Adelson. Mike Hengel's departure from the company was announced in the midst of this drama. The one thing I wanted to be clear about, though, is while Mike was invited here based on the hook of this drama, he actually has a tremendous amount of experience over nearly 40 years in the industry. He graduated from the University of Missouri, the School of Journalism. He started his career as a reporter. He worked his way up and on across a range of different executive positions, including serving as an editor and as a publisher. He worked for news organizations in several states. I don't know that I will get them all, but it included Arkansas and Oklahoma and Michigan and California. And then in 2010, he landed in Las Vegas as the chief news executive, up until the change in ownership just recently. And I want to mention a quick aside that I want to offer Mike a little bit of extra credit for working through a different kind of turmoil, and that's the cancellation of flights and some disruptions in the weather in order to get here. But he hung in there and he got here, and I know he's a man who's used to disruption. Nevertheless, I wanted to thank him for working through all the changes and cancellations to get here. Please join me in welcoming our CAMS speaker, Michael Hengel.
Thank you very much, Caesar. Thank you, Dean Savitsky. You know, as Caesar pointed out, I've got 40 years, and the Reynolds name means a little bit more than a foundation for me. I actually worked my first job was for a newspaper that he owned, and I got a chance to meet him a time or two. As a matter of fact, he was still around when I left that company in about 1993. That was about the time that he died, but I had not a lot, but several encounters with him. And the facilities that you have here are really something to be proud of. And the faculty, that at least the ones that I've met, have been really impressive. But even more impressive than all of that is the questions and the students that I've had the chance to interact with in the short time that I'm here. So it's been a pleasure so far, and I'm looking forward to what follows this afternoon and tomorrow. And I did have a few headaches trying to get here, but I'm glad we were able to work things out. I was told, Caesar, that I was literally walking to the garage to drive to the airport with my son was going to take me on Sunday night, and I got a text that the flight had been canceled. And so I immediately went online to see if I could find another one. The weather didn't look that bad in Las Vegas, although it was raining, which creates all kinds of problems in Las Vegas. But all the flights were canceled that night, and all the flights on Monday were booked. So here I am on Tuesday. So thank you for waiting. Now, the sale of the Review Journal was announced on December 10th to News Plus Media Capital Group LLC, and it was a shocker to us. None of us ever saw it coming. I didn't. But for the second time in less than a year, the RJ had new owners. And you'd have to go back 70 years to find two dates where the newspaper had changed hands. Once was in 1994, right after Reynolds died. And one, I think it was 1994, about there, maybe 95. And the other was around 1948 when Reynolds purchased the newspaper. But here it was sold now twice in the same year. It was really unusual. And when asked who the investors were, which was a question that I had asked, in a room not unlike this, there were a lot more people there, but the announcement came, and I asked the question at the end, who are the investors? And the response was, don't worry about who they are, just do your jobs. And you can imagine how that went over in a room full of journalists. So, the tool belt of any journalist contains at the bare bones minimum 6 questions: who, what, when, where, why, and how. And we intended to ask those questions. Transparency and disruption of an industry are central to understanding what has happened in the last few weeks, in my view. Much of the dust has been kicked up around the sale revolves around the perception of transparency, and the fact that the newspaper could be sold twice in a year really underlines just how disrupted the news industry has become. Though some may have concluded that the sale of the RJ is not such a good thing, I'm really not one of them. It may not have been the best thing for me, but that only matters to me. And as Lou Holtz once said, 90% of people don't care about your problems, and the other 10% are glad you have them. And I think that probably holds true in many respects. The sale could end up being a very good thing for RJ readers, I'm convinced, because the paper may steer more resources to the important work of covering the news in Southern Nevada. In fact, there's evidence that that's already begun. You may have read about all the news positions in the newsroom that are being added, and I'm not sure what the net number is, but I know they're in the process of hiring about 30 people, some to replace positions that have yet to be filled, and others to create new positions. And hey, that's not a bad thing at all. And that would be a huge increase in the size of the newsroom. The RJ newsroom when I left was about 110 people, so you can see adding 15, 20, 30 people, whatever the number is a sizable number, and that surprises me. It surprised me really as much as the sale. Which news organizations these days are actually adding positions to their staff? That really only happens at a newspaper that is a step removed from the financial demands that historically have driven the decision-making process at them. Those pressures have been behind the reduction of staff in nearly every news organization from coast to coast over the past decade, and I've been involved in a lot of them, and that includes the RJ. While other news organizations are cutting staff, the RJ is increasing its staff, and by a lot. That fact probably only happens at a news organization that is now locally owned, where the value of the asset is measured by more than the annual financial return. So I'm hopeful that this will be good news for the RJ. But it'll take some time for us all to know for certain just how good of a thing this ownership change will become. And I would ask you to remember the angst that revolved around Rupert Murdoch's purchase of the Wall Street Journal in 2007. Those of you who remember know that there was a lot of talk and a lot of concern because Rupert Murdoch, up to that point, was known for his ownership of the New York Post, Fox News, and The Sun in London, and people were wondering, well, what's going to become of the Wall Street Journal? Well, the Wall Street Journal is a very well-respected newspaper now, just as it was for decades before. If anything, it's become a better newspaper than it was before. And so I would caution that there was a statement that the new owners of the RJ published around December 17th about what they intended to do, and I would look at that. And to the extent that they live up to that statement, I think this could be a very good thing, and I'm hopeful that it's going to become that. Many of you probably know the outlines of the story. It's all out there in great detail. I haven't even read it all. There's so much of it. And I'm not going to cover all of the details. I'm going to hit some of the peaks of it. Essentially what we had here was reporters. We had a sale of the newspaper. We didn't know who the investors were. The reporters worked aggressively to identify who the buyer was. Eventually, within 6 days, the RJ reports that the owner, as being the family of really one of the most successful casino owners in the world. And then we harken back to before the sale, a few weeks, reporters were ordered to observe the daily routine of 3 Clark County judges. And also before the sale, a lengthy report in a Connecticut newspaper was highly critical of one of the same judges that the RJ had taken a look at. And that judge happened to be presiding over a case involving the new owner. And then a few days after that, the editor of the newspaper, me, is out. All of that occurred before Christmas. Since then, the news has slowed, but it's still grinding. There were new developments last week, including a new publisher being named. So transparency helps to understand what is going on in the minds of the reporters and the editors and how these stories came about. The RJ, in my time and long before my time, has been very aggressive in its expectations of transparency from those that we cover. As I said, it's been going on for years, and it's certainly continued in the years since I've been here. We've always demanded transparency from public agencies over which we reported, and that includes the city of Las Vegas, the Clark County, the 2 adjoining cities, North Las Vegas and Henderson, the Clark County School District, the state of Nevada, all of them. As a matter of fact, the RJ is still involved in a lawsuit, a protracted lawsuit over freedom of information issues against the Clark County District Attorney's Office that we filed last year over its failure to be transparent with a secret unaudited cash account that it used to pay witnesses for testimony in criminal cases. And only weeks before the sale, in November, we had unveiled a new website titled For the Record, which contains databases of salaries of public officials, homicide cases, and restaurant inspections, and plans were to keep adding databases to this. Certainly the level of transparency required of a private business like the RJ is not the same as a public agency. But as a business in a constitutionally protected industry, there is some expectation of transparency, and we were working from that. When you think about what any news organization does day in and day out, transparency is central to it. So there wasn't any question in our minds that we would attempt to report the stories as we did, and we first wanted to find out who the investors were. Even as reporters walked from a room like this where the announcement of the newspaper sale had occurred, they went about doing their jobs, tweeting the news and conducting background checks and searching documents on their smartphones for details about any possible owner. From that day, and probably until now, the staff has worked tirelessly to produce compelling reports on who the investors were, what their intentions might be, and how the sale might affect editorial policy and news coverage. All in the face of some level of uncertainty over what would be published and what would not. And our strategy in the newsroom was to pursue the story as we would any other. I did not ask anyone to throttle back because it involved our own publication. All we could do was attack it as we would any other story, fairly, accurately, and aggressively, and let the chips fall where they may. And to be fair, no one requested that we pursue the story differently than we did. The morning after the sale was announced, which would have been December 11th, during a question and answer session about the sale of the newspaper, in the newspaper's lunchroom, reporters and editors questioned the publisher about the sale and some late-night editing changes. I was among those asking questions. The questions were very direct and pointed, including mine. It was shortly after that meeting in the lunchroom that the idea of a buyout was suggested to me. Early retirements had been offered a week or so before, but you had to meet certain thresholds, which at the time I did not meet. When approached, that sent a message to me. And I understand really what was going on with that. Every newspaper publisher deserves the right and the opportunity to pick their own editor. The RJ had had an extraordinary amount of turnover in the publisher's office over the past 5 years. The newspaper now is on its 7th publisher since 2010. And that was after 2 decades of relative stability in that office. Up until December, I had managed to survive the turbulence in top management. I was one of 2 department heads who had not been replaced over that time, and some positions had been replaced more than once. And that just, you can mark that up as a crazy time in our industry. In my tenure as editor of the RJ, I knew wasn't going to last forever. So it's really not unusual that I'm out. What was unusual in my mind was that I had lasted for 5 years under so many top management changes. That takes a toll on you. Each new regime brings with it a new set of goals, new strategies, new expectations. And adapting to each publisher and the changes they brought, all good people whom I respect a lot, was a struggle. It really reminds me of the story of 2 deer hunters in nearby deer stands. One hunter encounters a wildcat in his deer stand, and what follows is a ferocious fight between the hunter and the wildcat. Finally, the hunter who's being attacked, yells out to his hunting companion, shoot it, and shoot it now." "I can't," the companion responds, "I might shoot you." And the hunter, being mauled, yells back, "Just fire up here among us. One of us has got to have some relief." That's kind of the way it felt. That's what it's, the full scope of the owner's goals and expectations that we have now are just probably taking shape. I'm not there now, so I don't know exactly. They, on the other hand, had the benefit of reading the RJ over the past 5 years since I was named editor because they lived here. So they had a body of work to evaluate. They likely had formed their own opinions and their own plans, and maybe I didn't fit into them. They also had seen the way that the coverage of the newspaper sale had been handled. Maybe they had a different idea on how the paper should be edited going forward. I don't have a problem with that. It was always a privilege and usually a pleasure to edit the RJ. I would consider it the highlight of my career and one of the highlights of my life. Now, despite the challenges with the initial story, reporters continued to work sources trying to identify the investors behind News Plus Media Capital Group, LLC. Reporters quickly followed the story of the sale with the details on the very high purchase price, which is $140 million, considerably more than what it had sold for a few months before. By Monday, remember the sale took place on Thursday, many media outlets were reporting, were openly speculating that the new owner was the family of Sheldon Adelson. Now, I think all of you know who Sheldon Adelson is. He's one of the most successful casino operators in the world, really, but certainly in Nevada. He owns the Sands, or he's the principal behind the Sands Corporation, owns most of the stock. and that includes the Palazzo and the Venetian in Las Vegas, as well as the Sands Convention Center. And he has holdings in Macau and Singapore, as well as in Pennsylvania. He also owns a newspaper in Israel, Israel Hayom, which is, as I understand it, the largest circulation newspaper in Israel. He's a significant donor to typically Republican causes, so he's very active in politics in the United States. Meantime, the secrecy surrounding the sale created a number of issues and challenges. On December 16th, Glenn Cook, the Review Journal's award-winning senior editorial writer and right now the interim editor, penned a very hard-hitting editorial on the Clark County School District's lack of transparency over teacher contracts. Cook had written, I don't know how many editorials in the previous year about agencies and some of their issues with lack of transparency, but in this one we also had to address what looked like our own lack of transparency over the identity of the investors. That took up part of the editorial. That's the kind of thing we were running into. And then about noon on Wednesday, December 16th, reporters received confirmation from credible sources who was behind the purchase. The RJ was ready to post the story mid-afternoon on Wednesday, and we moved the story up through channels and waited. Finally, at 7 p.m., when the Wall Street Journal was beginning to report through unnamed sources that the buyer was Adelson, I ordered at 7:25 that the story be posted. The print edition of the next morning contained the first on-the-record acknowledgement by the family of the ownership. Naming the owner was one milestone in really a still unraveling story. Just before the sale announcement, a small newspaper in New Britain, Connecticut, had inexplicably published an article criticizing Clark County District Judge Elizabeth Gonzalez. The judge had no ties to Connecticut, but her Las Vegas caseload included a high-profile lawsuit against Adelson and his Las Vegas Sands Corporation. Michael Schroeder, who operates the New Britain Herald, where the article by Edward Clarkin had appeared, was also the manager of News Plus Media Capital Group, LLC. Finally, the RJ staffers had a clue to help explain the unprecedented assignment they had received in early November, about the same time that details about the newspaper sale were being finalized. Over objections by RJ management, reporters were ordered to observe Gonzalez and two other judges for a couple of weeks. Puzzled reporters produced a 15,000-word diary of mundane court activities and moved on. And we were glad we were done with that. It didn't make much sense to us. But now the puzzle pieces begin to snap together in a different way. And on December 8th, the RJ made global headlines by detailing the assignment, which is out there if anybody wants to read it. The following Sunday, what day would that have been then? Anyway, I've forgotten the date, but it would have been about 10 days after the sale was announced. The RJ ran its first front page editorial in decades, pledging to continue to fight for readers' trust on a daily basis. Another editorial in the same edition showed how the interests of the Adelson family might influence the editorial stance of the RJ, and as it turns out, really not that much, because we were eye to eye on so many issues. On Tuesday, December 22nd, I was surprised by an email saying that my application for voluntary retirement was accepted. Curious wording, I thought, as I had not requested it, though it had been suggested to me. And now it was an offer I couldn't refuse. The email continued, the new owner of the paper would like to announce your departure in a front page story that they are preparing. Less than 90 minutes after receiving the email, I went before the staff to announce that I was stepping down. The reporting team, meanwhile, continued to pursue sales-related issues professionally and relentlessly in my absence. And reporting the sale, as I said, of the newspaper and its aftermath has presented many challenges for the staff. Though some expressed some trepidation None hesitated to pursue the story, and all responded with great determination, professionalism, and commitment to transparency. News organizations coast to coast have lauded the work. Here are a few examples. Take a swig here first. Quote, this is from the LA Times. On the other side of it is a newly re-energized staff of Las Vegas journalists whose aggressive, defiant reporting on the sale has won widespread accolades, even though it may cost some their jobs. From the Washington Post. It shows that they are not afraid to stand up to the people who sign their paychecks, which is very admirable, said Andrew Seaman, chairman of the Society for Professional Journalists Ethics Committee in the Washington Post, USA Today's Rem Ryder had this to say: in an inspirational example of journalistic integrity, the RJ staff has continued to pound away at the saga of their own ownership, period. And finally, just the other day, was a quote. It stood out because it was a jaw-dropping scoop, said Lindsay Beyerstein, a Sidney Hillman Foundation judge, in awarding the RJ an unsolicited Sidney Award for the month of January. Their coverage is a coup for transparency, accountability, and journalistic independence. And I think it does reflect on the transparency and the importance of it in our staff. We needed to find out who the investors were in the newspaper. That needed to be told. And to the extent that observing the judges raised some questions that resolved around the sale, that too needed to be reported and questions need to be asked. Once the who was established, the questions turned to why and how. And I think that more than in past decades, those questions really loom large for any newsroom. Journalism must focus on why and how. Context and perspective are crucial. The events and news of the day really have become commodities. And even and that's different from when I got out of journalism school in 1976, people depended on the news organizations that I was working on back then to tell them a lot more about the who, what, when, where than they do now. Options were much more limited then than they are now. News is everywhere. No longer as dependent on news organizations to provide news and information, readers crave context and perspective, the why and the how. That helps make a news organization relevant. That's where the best news organizations will separate themselves from the pack going forward. And also going forward, the new owners of the RJ, I think, are in a great position to prove some skeptics wrong. This purchase presents a unique opportunity to leave a great legacy for the community of Las Vegas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. We will move to the Q&A segment, and there is a mic for anybody who's willing to raise your hand and ask the first question.
Hi, my name is Ryan.
All right.
And at the very beginning, you said you were hopeful, but then there was obvious transparency problem. And I'm wondering how, even though they weren't transparent, you are still able to be hopeful. That would scare me.
I choose to be hopeful. I think that this is a great opportunity. Newspaper in Las Vegas is a great asset. And, maybe that came as a surprise, who knows, about the way that we reported it. But I believe that this is a great opportunity for the new owners to really take the newspaper to a new level. And I'm not going to assume they're not going to do that. I'm going to assume that they will.
I'm Howard. We met earlier today.
Yeah.
So I applaud your optimism, but I want to ask: was it someone on your staff who uncovered the fact that the Judge Gonzalez story in New Britain was actually attributed to a person who didn't exist?
No. I think Well, actually, we had once we were trying to dig into that, we realized we couldn't find this Edward Clarkin person. It didn't exist. I believe it was somebody from the Hartford Courant who actually figured out the connection between Schroeder and Clarkin, and that Edward Clarkin is a combination of Schroeder's middle name and his mother's maiden name, Clarkin. So it wasn't us that discovered that, but we had discovered that we couldn't find this Clarkin anywhere. He didn't seem to exist. So as it turns out, he didn't.
Kind of back to the transparency question a little bit. So I believe it was under your watch that the newspaper started running almost immediately once the Adelson connection was clarified, that the sort of disclosure statements about the ownership, both I think one that was kind of running in the print edition, as well as a kind of boilerplate that was attached to anything related to anything Adelson related, which was, you know, a large percentage of the news that you were reporting. I think within the last couple of days, the new publisher has decided to say, you know, we're gonna kind of ratchet that back a little bit and not be quite so, I guess, aggressive with our disclaiming or disclosing on that. Do you have thoughts on that? Do you have thoughts about kind of what drove your decision to do that in the first place, and or kind of thoughts about the decision to do less of it now?
Well, the decision to include that into the newspaper on page 3 is kind of a disclaimer about the Adelson's interests occurred after I left, not before I left, and then it was removed also after I left. I don't think there's any question but what I still see some of the references to some potential conflicts in the stories, which I think are appropriate. So there doesn't appear, in my view, to be any backing up from the fact that they're going to disclose what needs to be disclosed whenever that's necessary. I think that should be the operative thing. Whether you put it all on page 3 in a, like a billboard that maybe doesn't get read that often, or whether you insert it into the story as appropriate, there is no getting around the fact that conflicts exist, as they do. Conflicts exist with any ownership of any newspaper, and you got to be open about them. That's what transparency is about. It's not about, you can't avoid conflicts. You do have to be transparent about them. Yes. I'll repeat it if you don't want to. Okay.
Bit of a workout here.
Yeah.
You mentioned, my name is Tyler, you mentioned earlier in your speech that the buyout may have been indicative of kind of disruptive journalism. Do you think this might be an ongoing trend in the greater news industry, and how would this affect young people such as us?
No, I don't think so. I think this was a unique circumstance. I don't really know exactly what the thinking was in offering me the buyout. And no, I don't think it is any particular trend. This is, let's face it, I've been in business 39 and a half years, never came across anything like this in that time. I wouldn't say it's a trend. One event doesn't make it a trend, no.
Connected to this last question, is there some moral of the story, particularly for students who might be thinking about careers in journalism, or students not interested in news but maybe striving to understand how media works?
I think for me the moral of the story is we're in the newsroom, we're in the putting stuff in the newspaper business. And so you got to work hard to get the stuff that needs to get in there, and do a good job of doing that. And you never know what's going to happen after that, but we got to be committed to reporting accurately, reporting fairly, and reporting what needs to be reported. And thank goodness it got reported, it got published, and not just reported, but published. And I'm grateful for that.
Hi, my name is Annie.
Hi,
When the story first broke, there was a lot of hand-wringing about Adelson buying the paper on the verge of a caucus year and kind of a focus on political motivations. But I'm curious to your thoughts about how the paper continues to cover the industries that Adelson is so heavily financially involved on that are also a huge part of Las Vegas.
Well, it presents some perception issues, perhaps, with some of his competitors, I suppose. But, you know, I think that speaks to a lot of what happens right here, which is that's why you go to journalism school. That's what you learn the craft, you learn the standards, you learn the ethics, you bring them to the newspaper. They're there, and the reporter who covers that industry, Howard Stutz, is an all-star reporter, and he's going to report what needs to be reported. And honestly, I don't think there's any reason to think that anybody is going to ask him not to do that. I honestly don't think that that's going to happen with the Adelsons.
Hello, my name is Jamal. Kind of a follow-up to that, you quoted the Washington Post had said that some of the journalists kind of risked their jobs. Did any journalists lose their jobs in pursuing this story?
I'm the only one who is out, and whether you perceive that as my decision or their decision, but no, not as far. There's been reporters who reported on this story who have left, but they weren't forced out.
Hello. I asked questions earlier
Yeah.
when you visited my class. You've been very gracious to the Adelsons and all that. I have to ask, as a part of your buyout, is there a non-disparagement clause, or
Yes,
that's affecting you?
it is a standard agreement. It's not a gag order, though. It's not, and I don't feel the need to trash anybody in this. I have respect for them. I have respect for the others involved in it. It's a tough situation, but I'm speaking from the heart when I say that.
So we've been talking a lot about transparency, and I was just wondering, how do you keep the same level of ethics and transparency in an age where you can break news at any time on any platform? And do you still have the time to put the same amount of research and effort into every story you publish, or are there times where you have to make a decision between publishing the story now and getting it out to the readers versus holding it back and waiting a day or a week or an hour?
No, you need verification. That's our standard, or was the standard there. I'm sure it still is that we need reliable, credible sourcing on any story before we publish. And if we can't be, let me give you an example. If you, because this is where it comes up the most, is you're in the newsroom, you hear something on the scanner, something's happening, and you hear maybe some other news agency report that this is happening, and all they've had is what's on the scanner. Well, we're not going to do that. We're going to verify somehow that this is actually an event, because a lot of things that go through the scanner don't end up being what was reported on the scanner. And you don't want to get in, so we're willing to give that up, that being first, because we're waiting for some kind of verification. Now, it doesn't mean you have to quote an official source. If you see a fire, there's a fire, and you don't need to have the fire department tell you that there's a fire. So, there's an example where you might go with something without an official source, but it's a credible, reliable source. But that's the key, is that we're not going to report, even though we want to be competitive with all the news agencies who are covering the news, we have standards, and we're going to live up to them. And if somebody reports something without meeting that standard, they would get talked to about that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I see a hand back here.
Hi, thanks. So a lot of our students are strategic communications majors, and you've talked a lot about the various journalism side aspects and ramifications of this sale. It seemed to me from the outside that the strategic communication PR angle of this sale was a disaster. I guess starting with expecting journalists not to ask questions and finishing with the public not caring. Could you opine at all on sort of the PR efforts that were made around this?
Well, let's see. I wasn't really focused on them. I think I would have. It could have been handled differently, and I wondered at times whether what was happening. I mean, where were they getting advice on some of this stuff? Because, but the
Do you know where were they getting advice?
well, it's been reported that I don't know at what point, but at some point Mark Fabiani entered the picture, who is a crisis control expert. So I'm sure he is he still advising them? I don't know. Was he advising them from the beginning? I don't know that either. Yeah, it was baffling from that perspective. But honestly, I didn't really spend that much time thinking about it. I was focused on two things, while I was there, which was first finding out who was the investors, and the second was, connecting the dots on this judge's thing.
Would you anticipate that the new ownership is going to in any way impact the joint operating agreement with the Sun?
No, I don't know. I think they'd have to get an agreement from the Sun if they want to change it up any. I think that's the way that works. Is if they want to. If both sides agree that they want to change it up, then it changes. You can't just force a change. Got any? Are you suggesting that maybe something happened with it that, because they'd have to agree to it?
I have no inside knowledge, but
Yeah, I don't either.
judging by what Mr. Adelson has done, the reason he has the biggest circulation newspaper in Israel Hayom, is that he gives it away for free. And he's not likely to want, I would imagine, to give away the Sun for free.
By the way, I'm not sure if everybody here knows, but there is a joint operating agreement in Las Vegas between the two. We're two daily newspapers there for a long time, the Las Vegas Sun and the Las Vegas Review-Journal. And sometime in the late 80s, they formed a joint operating agreement, which joint operating agreement, as you may or may not know, eliminates the high cost of production and distribution for one of the newspapers. They fold them in together and they take advantage of that. It cuts costs significantly, and both sides consider that to be a better situation, and they work out some financial arrangements about how this is going to work. And that's what's been going on in Las Vegas since the late 80s. And right now, the Las Vegas Sun has its own website and its own niche products, but it also has, most days it has an 8-page, no ads insert into the Review-Journal. It's all content. I think on Saturday it's 6 pages, on Sunday it's 10, so it averages 8 pages a day. And they can put in it whatever they want. We don't check it out beforehand. We don't get it any until it's being printed at the same time as our paper is being printed, so we have no access to it. It's just another part of the paper. Now, question is, will that change any going forward? Who knows? It would have to be something that would be worked out as an agreement between, I think, between the owners of both newspapers. Yes, right over here.
Hi, my name is Jonathan. So in light of things like, Jeff Bezos, buying out Amazon and, advertorials and sponsored content, native advertising, it seems like there's a lot of the business arm that's kind of grappling with journalism. What do you feel like, this sort of this purchase would kind of affect that?
I think the purchase of the newspaper, as I said earlier, really changes the dynamics potentially of the financial demands on the newspaper. The decisions, as long as I was with the RJ and in every other newspaper that I've been at, has been, it's an investment. It's a financial investment, and the investors expect a return. There's a lot of pressure to produce a fair return for them. This might change that, because if one newspaper is owned by one person, it's just up to him to decide how much of a return he or she wants from it. So if they're willing to, and what they're doing that I've read about is adding positions. That's adding cost. That's reducing profit, unless they're able to, in the long haul, produce more revenue because of it. So I would say that changes the dynamics, because it changes the expectations potentially. So, and that's why I feel like that could end up being a really good thing for people who read the RJ, is there may be a little less pressure on the financial side. So we'll see. I don't even know whether we'll know, because it's a private company. We won't know what but you'll be able to see in the product, I think.
Hey, Michael. Todd Feltz, my crisis communications class is here today. And I just wanted to follow up on something that Sheila asked you. Imagine on December 10th, if when they brought you into the room and announced that there was new ownership, and they had a nice flyer and information about the investors. I mean, how would the story have changed if the transparency began on December 10th?
I think it would have been a completely different story. And it would have been a very short-lived story. It would have been a big story anyway, because of the political implications of it. Mr. Adelson has, he's a force in politics. So there would be a lot of interest over that, but I don't think it would have lasted like it has, or did.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that part of the reason for the vigorous investigation into who was taking over the paper was to mitigate in the public eye any notion of a conflict of interest in the fact that Adelson had taken over?
No, because we didn't know who had taken over when we started doing it. We just knew we wanted to find out, and we thought we needed to find out who the investors were. The speculation began fairly quickly that Adelson was behind it, but we didn't know that. We didn't know that until we reported it, for sure. And so, no, I don't think it was designed to find out who the investors were. Period. That was the goal. Who was it? And not because this or that, just because it needed to be reported.
I think we'll take maybe one more question. And I happen to have one, so how about that?
Oh.
This room is populated by people with a range of different career interests. So I want you to address the issue of opportunities for students interested in media in the broad sense. What are you thinking, anticipating, and feeling?
Well, there are opportunities. There's not as many opportunities as there might have been 10 years ago because there's not as many jobs. But there's never enough good journalists, and I know in Las Vegas they're looking for some right now. So there's opportunity there, and as far as the other, you know, I'm not sure exactly whether you're talking BuzzFeed or whether you're talking Huffington Post. You know, actually, maybe there are more positions available now than there were then. They're just not at newspapers. They're elsewhere. But you know, I would encourage anybody who has an interest in that to not be scared away for any reason from it, because it is really it's a fascinating craft, and you know, I have no regrets. It seemed to me 40 years ago when I got into it, it was kind of dicey then. You know, there weren't a lot of opportunities. It didn't seem like. I had a couple of jobs, and I just took one. You know, and I was only going to do it for as long as it was still something I wanted to do, and that's what I did. It happened to be 39 and a half years. So it's good. It's more fun than any other job that I can imagine, with the exception perhaps of teaching. You know, that's really important, really rewarding. That's the same thing with journalism. It's really important. It's really rewarding. So if that's what you're looking for, there it is.
Thank you for that. Let me mention a couple of things. One is 5:30 reception, Lynn Reading Room. Everybody's invited. Secondly, Michael will be around for another 24 hours or so. So if there's anybody who wants to follow up, have a chat, a conversation, I know he's going to appear in at least a couple of classes tomorrow. By all means, catch up with Michael through the dean's office or through me. Now, please join in thanking Michael for his presentation tonight. Thank you, Michael.